think we should be ready to start, I guess. I just need a signal from someone. Shall I? Okay, thank you. So welcome everybody. We are very happy to be here in San Francisco for this special event. Let me thank you, first of all, the University of San Francisco. Thank you, Father Paul, the faculty, the students. Where are the students, actually? Are there some students? Yeah, okay, some. Okay, don't be shy. Let me thank also the Tibetan community of Northern California. I see some of them scattered around. Thank you. Thank you for coming and for being with us here today. But let me make a special thank to the members of ICT. Actually, all of you who I've mentioned before, you can easily become a member of ICT. You just go to savetibet.org, make a small or better big donation, and you can be a member. But actually, without your support, we couldn't do what we have been doing over 30 years. Last year it was the 30th anniversary of ICT, and so we are still very much alive, and thanks to your support, continue to have an impact. We are especially happy to be here in San Francisco because, as you know, we are based in Washington, D.C. We don't come out very often for meetings, and we should do more. But this is a special opportunity because San Francisco is the city of one of the most consistent and effective U.S. leaders in general, but especially in U.S. history when it comes to Tibet. The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, will join us shortly, and this is really a great honor for us to have her with us today. As you know, this country is passing through some interesting, political moments, and for her to find the time to be with us, I think it sends a very, clear signal, where priority is and where values can be in politics. And I think we should be all very grateful for this. And I want to thank also her staff who has made this possible, and they do really great work behind the scene. With her also we have another extraordinary woman, Jetsun Pema. Jetsun Pema is the younger sister of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but most importantly is the woman who has built from scratch the education system for dozens of thousands of Tibetan children in exile, Tibetan refugees. She has done this for decades under the vision and the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. She's a good friend of ICT. She's a sort of a mythical figure for Tibetans. They call her the mother of Tibet. Actually, we know that she's the mother of Tencho, our Tencho. She's there. But actually, Tencho has to share her mother with the Tibetans and with all of us tonight. So really, thank you, Tencho, for sharing your mom. These two extraordinary women will be moderated by our chairman, Richard Gere. I can say many things. I would only say that I'm very proud to be part of an organization that has Richard as the chairman. Richard is a compassionate man, is very thoughtful, is very knowledgeable, is very generous with his time, but also with his financial support to ICT. And actually, his matching gift is coming up. When is coming up? Next week. So watch out for that because we have to raise funds by the end of the year and continue to do our programs. I'm not revealing any secret if I say that Richard is also very famous, but being famous helps sometimes in Washington to open some doors. And Richard has been very, very consistent coming down to Washington for meetings, naturally with the speaker, with Dianne Feinstein, many other members. But when you open the door, then you have to walk through every day to make progress. And actually, the progress that we have been able to make over the last couple of years, you may know last year the Congress passed the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, which is legislation that wants to open up Tibet to the world, allow the Tibetans to interact with diplomats, with journalists, with NGOs, with organizations like the American Himalayan Foundation. We were last night, and I want to acknowledge also here Dick Blum, the chairman, and Erica and Norbu, I think they're also here. And we heard how difficult it is, for even NGOs that want to do health work, education work, to be able to operate in Tibet. So this is a strategic move to try to open up Tibet to the world. And more recently, the Tibetan Policy and Support Act of 2019, which focuses on many important issues, but specifically on religious freedom and on the question of the succession to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. As you know, the Chinese government has already plans to select their own Dalai Lama, and we cannot allow this to happen in silence. So we need the full force of the US Congress, the US government, but also, frankly, US and world citizens to stand up to this. This progress is possible, and I want to mention for once at the beginning, by the effort of the ICT staff. Because they work every day, not only to make this event possible, but really to make sure that your voice is heard in Washington, in Berlin, in Amsterdam, in Brussels, wherever we are every day. So I want to thank them for this in particular. So now I think we can begin, because I've already taken a lot of time. And so I would like to please join me in welcoming the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Jetsun Pamela. And the one and only Richard Gere. And we will begin shortly, but I would like, before giving the floor to Richard, to ask Dick Blum to say a few words on behalf of the senior senator from the state of California, Dianne Feinstein, who couldn't be with us tonight, but he would like to say a few words. Please, Dick.
Dianne says, welcome to you all. Richard, say whatever you want, but I don't want to be responsible for it. But I think you all, or many of you know, this group has known each other and worked together for decades. Dianne went with me to Dharamsala before we were married. That was 40 years ago. And my daughter Heidi and I were just in Dharamsala about a month ago, and I'm happy to tell you that His Holiness is in good spirits. He's invigorated. Maybe one of these days we'll get him over here again, but we'll have to wait and see. In any event, this group, it's amazing that after all this time, we get this kind of a turnout, because it's so appreciated. Maybe you don't see it here, but the Tibetan people still see it. And the problems are not getting any better, they're getting worse. For those of us who spend a fair amount of time in Nepal, the Chinese now have a grip on Nepal that they never had before. When Xi Jinping came to Kathmandu about 3 weeks ago, they made the Tibetans not wear their traditional clothes. They told them not to make any noise, and they get away with it. And there are 50,000 Tibetan refugees in Nepal alone. So the problems go on. We still are able to, with our foundation, do a lot of work for Tibetans, mainly those not in Tibet. We carry out some programs in Tibet, rather quietly. But your support and your interest in ICT is critical in Jetsun Pema, her husband, Tencho, You got a good team to back. So thank you, and anything you can do in terms of prayer flags, support, checks, will be appreciated.
Can everybody see, because I think we'd rather sit here than use this. Great. It's going away. Thank you. Well, this is great, seeing everybody here. We got the sound together. We have one mic, or does everyone have a mic? I'm kind of amazed at the energy that we have on the stage here. These two incredible people, these incredible women, who are, I mean, I've known each of them probably 30 years. I think I was trying to remember, I remember when Jetsun Pema and I met, which was during a Kala Chakra initiation in Recon in Switzerland in 1985, I think it was. And I was so impressed by her then. I had very black hair at that moment. She did too, I think. Yeah. But we've known each other a long time, and she is one of the extraordinary people. She is the mythic one. And she's married to another extraordinary person, Tempa Sireng, who's sitting here right now, who I met on my very first trip to Dharamsala in 1981, I think it was, or 82. 82. Stand up, just say hello. Tempa has for many decades been one of His Holiness's closest advisors and trusted advisors. And we're so happy to have him as a special board member and mentor of ICT. It's really important to us. Now, the other person on the stage with me here had nothing else to do in life. Had a few extra minutes sitting around, was bored around the house, so she said she'd fly into San Francisco, her home, and be with us. We have known each other also for decades, and I couldn't remember, neither of us can remember the circumstances, and I think it might have been around HIV/AIDS, was the first time. She unfortunately remembers me not dressing as nicely as I do right now.
It's the shoes.
Something about the shoe.
One of the first times that Richard visited our office, people were so excited. Richard Gere was coming to the office to talk about Tibet. It was so exciting. And he came, not with an entourage, but with a sole of a shoe flapping in the hallway, partially held together by duct tape, but not entirely. In any event, he's always been a person of purpose, and not to let any of that rest of it stand in the way, even though he's a movie star.
When I was thinking about these two incredible women, people, and what they have in common, they are, by any just objective looking at reality, extraordinary people who've had extraordinary lives. And there are qualities that extraordinary people have. In Buddhism, the quality of a great bodhisattva or a Buddha would be the three qualities which are associated with tantric deities, Avalokiteshvara, and Manjushri, and Vajrapani. And those three qualities are compassion, heart, I mean deep heart, the heart of a bodhisattva, who really empathizes and is compassionate in the extreme. The wisdom of Manjushri, that understands reality, understands how this is all a relative matrix that we're in. We're all deeply connected. There's not one of us who can pull ourselves outside of this relative universe where we all affect each other. And the third one is Vajrapani, which is strength, power, and skill. And these two women have all of those qualities and have displayed them for their whole lives. And certainly in the 30 years, 35 years that I've known them, have never let me down when I have thought of what would they think is the best thing to do in this situation? And who would I want to align myself with? Who would I want to be the friend of? Who would I want to be the partner of? Who would I want to stand and be a troublemaker with? And these are two women that I would do that anytime, day or night. I was actually thinking about something that Steve Bannon said about the speaker. And he said it with great admiration, I think. He said that she's like tough boot leather. And there is an element of that she's a bulldog. She gets stuff done. But what he doesn't understand is you can be tough boot leather, but you got to have the compassion and the wisdom to go along with it. And then you can really change the world for the better. You can really touch people. And the speaker, not only is she the first woman speaker, she's also the second woman speaker. So I'm curious. Look, this is a really wacky world we're in now. And, you know, I was talking to some people in the reception before. It's like our bodies have an illness. There's an alien illness that's coming out now. And, of course, you have to deal with it, and you take medicine. But our society, not just here, but the entire world. I'm on my way to Poland in a few weeks, because Hungary, Poland, Eastern Europe is going the same way. These kind of crazy ideas, this poison illness is coming out of the body politic and out of some individuals. And it's really, I think it's worth talking about. How do the two of you engage a world that is moving in this direction? You're trying to get something done. I mean, both of you trying to do extraordinary things to save your people and make a better world. And you're running up to this kind of negative energy on the planet right now. Now, I've seen both of you in situations, especially the speaker, where most people would go crazy, completely stone cold crazy at some of the things that she has to deal with. I've seen her take a deep breath and go, the game is much bigger than that, than dealing with one crazy person or one crazy idea. It's a long-term game that bodhisattvas play. And I just wondered if you could share a little bit, both of you, about how you deal with that daily, day after day after day of dealing with the selfishness, self-cherishing, and ignorance.
Jetsun, do you want to go first? I'll go first. Okay, well, let me just thank Father Fitzgerald for the hospitality here at University of San Francisco.
Thank you, good Father.
So much.
Thank you, Father.
Dianne Feinstein has been such a force in the Congress for decades on helping the people of Tibet, and Dick Blum, her husband, has been a force in his own right, probably introduced her to the people of Tibet those many years ago. Thank you, Richard, and I'm so glad my husband Paul is here and your daughter Heidi. So it's a family affair for all of us, as well as having His Holiness's sister here. What an honor for all of us. So Richard knows this story, but since he asked the question, this is, His Holiness teaches us about love and our hearts being full of love, and Richard can teach what he has learned from His Holiness, and I've seen him do it. And I'm just remembering that one of the first times I saw you preaching and teaching was when the president of China was hosted at a state dinner by President Clinton a long time ago, almost over 25, almost 30 years ago. And that was a state dinner, and Richard came to Washington so we could have a stateless dinner for the people of Tibet. Remember that night?
It was right across the street, actually.
Right across the street, and it was remarkable. Well, I'll tell you more about it if you ask in a little bit. But in terms of one of the lessons that I learned from His Holiness that helps me and what I do is that, I'll give you this story. Richard's heard it a million times. We're in Dharamsala, And we're with His Holiness in the morning, and there are all of these people coming over the mountains telling us the torture that they've been subjected to, that they know of, and the horrible things that the Chinese government is doing to the people of Tibet. And it was horrible, and they were crying and kissing His Holiness's robe and this, and we saw this. I had led a delegation there, bipartisan delegation. We saw this. It was horrible. It was horrible. Later in the day, we had lunch with many lamas who had come from all over India to be there, young lamas. And we had lunch with all this delegation and that. And when it was my turn to speak, I talked about what we saw that morning and what we were going to do about it. Mr. Sensenbrenner was there, and he was going to do the visas, and the appropriators were there, and they were going to do the funding for this, that. Everybody had the judiciary people to do this or that. All of the things that our members were going to do, because if we do not speak out against violations of human rights in China, we lose all moral authority to speak out against human rights any place in the world. So I sit down. His Holiness gets up and he says to the lamas, "Let us all pray for Speaker Nancy Pelosi, that we rid her of her negative attitudes." That's what I learned that day. Just get rid of your negative attitudes. Just fight the fight. Don't be like them. Just fight the fight. And again, as you said, look at the long game and just have the right perspective with a heart full of love, as His Holiness would have wanted. But I never expected when he was praying for me that that was going to be the prayer. But that was a lesson, all right? So, Jetsun?
First of all, I would like to say that it's a great, it's a humbling experience and a great privilege to be here with you, Speaker Pelosi, and with Richard Gere. And we are very happy that so many of you have come here to hear us and to know something about Tibet, and we greatly appreciate this. Now, regarding what Richard was just asking, I've been all my life dealing with children, working for children. And I think, with all work, when you're working with children, the children have their problems, but they're not the type who express them. You have to really feel it from, what the child is feeling. Because many times the children are not able to express from within what they feel. So I think those of us adults who are dealing with children, I think we have to try to have the, the wisdom or the knowledge to try to look within that child. And if you're able to do that, then you solve a lot of problems. But the most difficult thing is dealing with the adults. Dealing with children is no problem for me. But dealing with adults, once you're an adult, you have your ego coming out, so there are always problems coming. And the more egoistic you are, you have more problems. So in the case of, dealing with people's egos and the problems that you face in life, I have the experience that we had, problem in the children's village when I started. And then I went to His Holiness and I said, I told him there's so many problems. The adults are always complaining there's not enough of this, not enough of that, and there's, always problems. And I find it very difficult to deal with the problems with the adults because they're always complaining. So His Holiness, he just looked at me and he says, that's why we are in samsara. So that was a big lesson that I learned from His Holiness, that we are all in samsara. We have not been able to get rid of our negative attitude. We haven't reached nirvana. So we have to deal with it as it comes. And as the Tibetan saying goes, we take each day as it comes. We make the best of today. We prepare for tomorrow. We look forward to tomorrow. And what is the past is something gone by. But we make the best of today. So I think if all of us learned to make the best of today, I think you overcome many difficulties that one faces in life.
Yeah, Pamela, you just a quick biography so that people can place kind of the voyage of your life. Your family came from a very small farming village,
Yes,
Taksar,
that's right. Yes.
in Amdo,
Yes.
very far away from the capital of Lhasa,
Yes.
very far away.
That's
And
right.
it had animals, a little farming, your mother and father, you had quite a few in your family at that point.
Yes.
You seeing the picture here? Where are they? Is it up there? Now, anyone who's seen the movie Kundun by Martin Scorsese, has anyone seen it here? Almost everyone has seen it. So you know basically the story. So when His Holiness was 2 years old,
Yes.
they started to come and test him to see if he was in fact the correct 14th Dalai Lama. And then by the time he was 4 years old when he came to Lhasa, the capital, I think he was about 4.
Around, yes, around
5
4.
maybe?
Around 4.
And you were born soon after they
I
came.
was born 1 year later.
Yeah, so,
Yes.
so from this farming village, all of a
That's right.
sudden they were royalty.
Yes.
And they were in Lhasa, it's the Dalai Lama, who was not only the religious leader, but he's the secular leader also of Tibet. It's a big deal. So she grew up in an aristocratic family, but really were farmers. And so you had a different upbringing than His Holiness or your older brother,
That's right.
Taksar Rinpoche.
Yes, yes.
Can you talk about a little what that was like before the Chinese invasion?
Well, I was, born the next year after His Holiness arrived in Lhasa, and he was already installed in the Potala. And of course, for me, growing up in Lhasa was quite an experience because my parents, they came from a tiny little village in the northeast of Tibet. And from that little village coming to Lhasa and being, given a big mansion to live in, to have servants and to have, everything at your beck and call. And so it was such an experience for my parents. But then when I was born, my sister used to say, "You're born with a silver spoon in your mouth," So when I was, as far as I remember as a child, what was most exciting was the fact that my mother would, from time to time, go to see His Holiness, baking his favorite bread, preparing his favorite dishes, and she would take it up to the Potala to give it to His Holiness. So sometimes she was to take me along, and those were very happy occasions, because for us to be able to go up to the Potala to visit His Holiness, it was always a privilege. And then also seeing His Holiness always surrounded by these elderly monks and being kind of a little bit controlled. Whenever we were in His presence, we had to behave ourselves. And so from an early age, I learned that I had to have great respect for His Holiness. And I seldom sort of considered him as a brother. It was always with great reverence. And that, I think, was a great privilege. But at the same time, it was also a big responsibility. Because being, related to His Holiness, you had to be always on the guard, so to say. So anyway, and then I lived in Lhasa till the age of 9. And then when I was 9, I was sent away to India to study in India. So my memory of...
That's extremely rare, isn't it? There weren't very many
Well, in those
Tibetan.
days, very few children from Tibet were sent to, only some of the aristocratic family children. But then in our case, we were sent because the Chinese at that time were just on the border of Tibet, and they were entering Lhasa, coming. So my mother felt that it was important to go to India and to get an education. And also at that time, my elder sister was not keeping too well. So my mother felt that she must also get some medical treatment in India. And so I was sent to India when I was around 9 years of age.
What was, just a few more questions there. Describe what Lhasa was like at that point.
Well, Lhasa at that time was...
We're talking about 1948, 49, just before the invasion.
That's right,
Yeah.
yes. But then, we, as being a girl, you're not supposed to go out as you please, we had a very sheltered life. And I remember when I was around 5.5, 6, we went to school. My sister's 2 children were around my age. So I became an aunt when I was 9 months old. Because my sister, she is like 20 years older than me. So she had her son when I was just 9. So my nephew and my niece, my nephew was 9 months younger than me. My niece was about 1.5 years younger than me. So we all grew up together. And then when I was around 5.5, we were sent to school. So I remember going to school, coming back, then also the games that we used to play as a child. But of Lhasa, I knew very little, except going for, pilgrimage to the cathedral, then going up to the Potala to see His Holiness. We led a very sheltered life.
It sounds like it was a happy life for you, too.
Yes, it was a very happy life. But then when I was 6 years old, our father passed away. So that was a very sad occasion for all of us in the family. Yes.
I remember a story that His Holiness has told many times, that he was quite a lonely boy up in the Potala Palace. And his closest friends were some of the other...
The sweepers.
Yes, sweepers.
Yes, the sweepers.
Who
yes.
weren't, kind of overly impressed by him.
Yes, that's right.
And that's why he liked them, is that he
right.
just treated him like a normal little boy, and if he was mischievous, they used to hit him. And, But he respected that, and he liked that. But I remember this one heartbreaking story where His Holiness talked about being up in the upper reaches of the Potala Palace, and very far away he could see his father, who he loved desperately, who was a real horse guy, very cowboy, kind of ballsy horse guy. And he came in through the gates, and you could see him very far away, and he was so looking forward to seeing his father, but his father went to see the horses first. And it struck me how sad that was, of seeing that he wanted to see his father. And I think there's part of that, you can see the delicacy in His Holiness is still that little boy, in a way, that grew up in that tower. It's very humanizing when I think of him that way. Speaker Pelosi, I know
Let me just say, if I may, because in all of the opportunities we've had to be in the presence of His Holiness, when you have been there, he's been very deferential to you and shown great respect and reverence for you. So it's sort of changed over time, or at least equalized over time. So I know how much the high regard and the love that His Holiness has for you. So we're honored so that you're here. Thank you. I did see His Holiness's room when we went to, well, we can talk about that if you wish. When we went to Tibet, we brought a delegation to Tibet.
Well, we can get to that, but I was just saying, you had a very similar upbringing in a very small farming village, Baltimore. Very poor, no power, no aristocracy around you, and.
Then we are in front of the.
No, but also where this came from in your life, that you wanted to serve, that you found a way to do it in an effective way.
Well, we were born in Baltimore, Maryland. Our whole family, a big family, 6 boys, 1 girl. One of my brothers passed away when he was a little boy from pneumonia, so I was raised with 5 brothers, and the youngest, me, I was 1 girl. And So we were born into a family that was devoutly Catholic, fiercely patriotic and loving America, very proud of our Italian-American heritage, and staunchly democratic. And the connection between the first and the last, the deeply Catholic and staunchly democratic, went together because what we had in common in those two respects was the concern for other people. That public service was a noble calling, that we all had a responsibility in a sense of community to look after each other, and that everybody had a spark of divinity within them. When God came down from heaven to become man, his participation in our humanity enabled us to participate in his divinity. So we were taught everyone has that spark of divinity within them, and we must respect them, whatever. And so that was really what our inspiration was. So some years later, when I had the privilege of meeting His Holiness Tom Lantos, who was a member of Congress from our area.
Was that the commission? That was the first time?
Yeah, but he didn't have a commission then. But he has a commission, well, the commission is established now, but then he was part of the Human Rights caucus that we had. And so he invited a few of us to meet with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This was 1988. I was within my first year of being in Congress. I couldn't even imagine that I would meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he came and he taught us about his plans for autonomy for Tibet. You know the agenda that he had at that time. And that he was the first person to receive the Nobel Prize with environmental considerations in the tribute. The first one, the first person. And then I saw him a few times more, but then I saw him in a couple years later in Rio, where he went to speak at the Earth Summit, which was the first really important climate crisis, and he spoke with the same thing about God's creation and in a spiritual way about what the obligation we had was to preserve the planet for future generations. But it was all, whether it was my family in Baltimore or His Holiness's teaching, it was all God's creation and our responsibility to it, and that to minister to the needs of God's creation is an act of worship. To ignore it is to dishonor the God who made us, and that had a consistency between my upbringing and the big heart that His Holiness and mind and the rest. Of course, I love when he told this story, being a Democrat, of when he received the wristwatch from Franklin Roosevelt when he was a little boy. You know that story better than anybody.
Tell the story. Well, I was in school in India, so I don't know anything about that watch. Only I saw that watch after His Holiness came into exile in 1959. He was able to bring that watch, and it's a very special watch. You have seen it. Have you seen it, Richard? You have.
It has the rising of the sun. You know how some watches have that? It has the rising of the sun on all that. And it was about science. Imagine that Franklin Roosevelt would know that this Dalai Lama would be so scientific as well as being so religious, and that combination of it all, something very special, something very needed now as well. But one time he said to me, we were hosting him in the Capitol, and he said, okay, I guess I'll show you the watch. He talks about it all the time. So he brought out the watch, and he handed it to John McCain. John McCain and I were co-hosting it, and John McCain was a wonderful...
John McCain really liked His Holiness. There's a picture of him with His Holiness in his office that every time I walked in there, he took me right over there immediately and was so proud of that. Right next to Goldwater's picture.
But John McCain was always hospitable, always helped us on all of our legislation, really a friend and a person who respected His Holiness so much.
So what do you think it is that makes us, I mean, it's obvious with Jetsun Pemela, What is it about the two of us that have given so much energy? There's nobody in Congress who is more steadfast in their concern, but dedication, and rock solid being there for the Tibetans than you.
Well, there are others. I'm part of a group, bipartisan, bicameral, by the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
of course,
but no one more than you.
And Senator Feinstein has been a real champion in this. In fact, the reason we were able to go to Tibet, Diane and I were meeting with the president of China, this one, and he is really a hardline guy. You know, we were hopeful that maybe, you know, something, but so we were telling, Diane was making the case, as she always did so clearly, about what the concerns we had about the culture, the language, the religion, the children, as we saw the children in Dharamsala, because they cannot be raised in their religion, faith, language, or culture in Tibet the way they could be outside of Tibet. So he was going on and on, and wait a minute, we've done this, and we gilded the roof of the temple, and we did this and that. And I said, you know, we're more concerned about what's going into the minds of the children than the gilding of the roof of the temple. Well, you go see for yourself. I said, well, I've been trying for 25 years to get a visa to go to Tibet. So if you're inviting us to go for ourselves, and Diane was very instrumental in pushing it, so I thank her for that right there. There were only about eight of us at the table with him because it was a leadership meeting. So we got the visa to go. And you want me to talk about that now?
See what?
Did you want to hear about the trip to Tibet?
I would love to hear about it.
Well, I didn't know.
Well, first of all, it was amazing because no one was being allowed into Tibet. I can't get into Tibet. Nobody was getting into Tibet. And certainly not any leaders, certainly not American leaders, were not being allowed in. So this was a huge deal. Everyone was wondering, how is she going to pull this off? How's the whole delegation going to pull this off?
We had a whole delegation. You know, it was fabulous.
And so it was, you were really smart on how you conceived to do this.
Well, he said, why don't you go see for yourself? Okay, give us a visa. But he didn't know that we were ready to go for ourselves. I think Matteo has something he wants to tell us. Oh, okay. Okay, well, anyway, we went to Tibet. It was something really like, they kept the people from us. We went to the Sera Monastery. We went to the Tibet University. We went to the temple with the gilded roof and that. We went to a family home where it was all for show. You know, it was really sad. It breaks your heart because here we were on the top of the world, where His Holiness had warned us so many years before about what was happening to the melting glacier, what was happening to the rivers, the great rivers of Asia, and then the rest, and what that meant to the planet, the connection of it all. And we saw that there, but we saw how, of course. See that, you know, I would say, oh, what's that? And of course it was a camera. They had cameras every single place where the monks would pray with this or that. And it was very, very sad. But the highlight for me was to go to His Holiness's room. We went right there to his room. Imagine that, in the palace. Imagine that this is where he was as a young person, right there. And this is where we must make sure he can return. We must return. One bad thing, I just have to tell you this one thing because everything was a show and this and that, and it was more if you want, or we'll have our own session one of these days. However, they took us to a home. Now we go to this home, and this is the home of typical Tibetans. And when you walk in, on the wall is a great big picture of the President of China. We all have that in our house, right? I was like, what? And so they gave us food and this or that. And too bad my daughter isn't here. She's taking her children to school and this or that. So when the daughter comes back, I say, how are your children? Children? It was all a fraud. You know, it's a complete Potemkin plus inside and outside. the building. So it was really, really sad. And we made our views known and our dismay known and the rest of that, both to the governor there, who's now in charge of the Uyghurs. They've moved him. He's so terrible.
What they learned in Tibet,
Yeah.
they exported. They took
They
the
did Uyghurs. And then we told the president of China when we went back to Beijing after. But you know what? I told the president Trump, when he was at the G20, I said, tell the president the whole world is watching what's happening in Hong Kong. And then tell him that we know that he has put in camps and 1, 2, perhaps 3 million Uyghurs. The president came back and said, he says they like it in those camps. And if you don't, you can, and he wants you to go see for yourself. Been there, done that. But anyway, it's a challenge that we have because for commercial interest, you know that people can look the other way in terms of what is happening, and whether it's Hong Kong, Beijing, all of Tibet in terms of human rights. Tibet just challenges the conscience of the world, and we saw that firsthand on the streets, in the homes, in the temple, in the university, and a fake museum they had that they cooked up some scheme of what the history was of Tibet there. So that's why His Holiness says, let's rid her of her negative attitude.
I like the image of Senator Feinstein and Speaker Pelosi. There's the superego and the id, where, as you described it. Diane is very, she knows what she's doing, it's very controlled, and you are completely emotional and out there. And you're a great combination, the two of you. I wish we could do this for hours. We can't. But I want to get some impressions, because I've seen the footage, the 1980 footage of Tibet was invaded in 1950. Some would say 1949, 1950. And they imposed themselves on the Tibetans. In 1959, it was intolerable. There was a threat against the life of the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama left. Tens of thousands of Tibetans left right away. And now there are maybe 150,000 Tibetans outside. What do you think? We use about that number. About 150,000 have gotten out. Very few get out. It used to be there were 3,000 or 4,000, 5,000 a year were walking out of Tibet, and mostly into Nepal. It's all finished. It's been locked up. Anyone who goes near that border is killed. The cooperation between the Nepalese and the Chinese now is so complete that there's no oxygen for the Tibetans to get out anymore. The oxygen for them within Nepal also is being closed off. A very, very desperate situation for the Tibetans there. But there was footage. There was a time in the 80s when there was a slight opening, and there were delegations of Tibetans who were allowed to go back to Tibet from Dharamsala and see for themselves and take films of what had happened. I think we're in the second or the third delegation?
Third delegation.
The third delegation. Could you tell us a
That's
little
right.
bit about what you found when you went
Yes.
back?
We were the third delegation, and we went to Tibet in the summer of 1980. And it was a very kind of, what shall I say, a very hard period for us, because at that time, the Tibetan people, they had nothing, It was a time when food was being rationed to the people, and what was rationed for 1 month, it was not even enough to have 2 meals a day. It only lasted, if you had 2 meals a day, it lasted like 15 days. So people were, half-starved. They didn't have
This was
any-
unheard of. This has not been in Tibet before. This starvation.
Starvation was never heard in Tibet. But then when the Chinese came to Tibet, they reversed the growing of the crops, because the Tibetans, we grew barley. Barley was the staple food of the Tibetans. But the Chinese don't eat barley. They prefer wheat. So they reversed the farming by growing wheat instead of barley. So for 2-3 years, there was very little crop. So many people, thousands of Tibetans died from starvation. And then also, most of the young people, you know, men and especially the men, they were loaded into trucks and taken to China to be used as laborers for the construction of the roads. So these construction camps, people were collected, like 300 persons would be collected from one region, and they would go, and then after about 6 months, you know, people returned back, and out of 300, there would hardly be like 20 or 25 people left, because there was starvation. So during the time that the Chinese occupied Tibet, 1.2 million Tibetans lost their lives. And our population, when Tibet was free, it was 6 million. Out of 6 million people, 1.2 million perished under the Chinese. So in 1980, when we went there, it was really a very sad experience. Everywhere that I went, every day we were in tears, because the people would tell us stories, we would listen, they would be crying, we would be crying, and the delegation, the third delegation, we spent 105 days within Tibet, and we covered an area of 13,000 kilometers by road, and we visited over 59 villages and towns, and we saw, especially the main function of this delegation was to look into the education of the Tibetan children. There was hardly any kind of school for the children, because the most important thing which was lacking was teachers for the children. Because during the Cultural Revolution, children didn't go to school. There was no teaching of Tibetan language. So when we were in Tibet, very few, even the younger people, like 20, 30 years old people, the young people didn't know their language, the written language. Of course, they spoke Tibetan, but then the written language, they didn't know. So it was only some elderly monks and elderly people who were teaching the children. And then, of course, under the Chinese rule, everything Tibetan, everything that was part of our culture was kind of sidelined. And all the teaching, the little teaching that was given was all in Chinese, and it was just to make the Tibetan people as Chinese as possible. So everywhere we went, we were really saddened to see the situation. And as Speaker Pelosi mentioned, everything was a show also. They took us to, in the nomadic areas to attend school, which was put up maybe a few days before we arrived. Then there would be some children sitting there in the school, and I would go and hold their hands, and their hands were all sort of bruised, and they were, they didn't look like as if they were learning to read and write, or, to be in the school. And if I lifted the carpet, which was in the tent in the school, and under the carpet was green grass. So there couldn't have been a school. It was, yes, so everything was kind of put on, like that was in 1980. And they still did the same thing when Speaker Pelosi went. Yes, so the situation in Tibet is really bad. And as Richard was mentioning, at one time we had many refugees coming into India. At one time, like in the early 80s and in the 85, 86, we used to receive like 1,000 children in a year coming for education to India, because there were no schools to be, to educate the
So
children.
the parents
in
were
Tibet.
sending the kids. The parents weren't even
They
coming
were
with them in many
smuggling
cases.
the children over the border. And at that time, the Nepalese, soldiers were not as strict as now. But today, there are hardly any children coming across. In 1 year, there might be 5 or 6 children coming. And all that has been now sort of stopped. And I think in Tibet, the situation is becoming worse and worse. People cannot move around freely. And then, of course, those who are working for the Chinese, they're highly paid. Their salary has really kind of doubled. And so, I mean, they're controlling the country with a very strong fist. So that way, that's why in exile for the Tibetans, it's very important that we keep up our, language, our religion, because what is being destroyed in Tibet, within our own country, we feel that it's the responsibility of the Tibetans outside to preserve this. And this is what we are trying to do, and we hope that we will have, that we can prevail in this effort, which His Holiness has really, he feels that the education is so important to preserve our culture and our religion, and that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. There's so much more to talk about here. It makes me a little crazy we can't go further, because Jetsun Pemela started the program, really, of education. And there's so much more to talk about here. How she achieved it, how the Tibetans in general achieved this, how successful they have been as refugees. One on their own, but it's also the people in this room and other rooms of people around the world who care about them and want them to succeed, have allowed them to have partners within the Tibetan community to help them. We have a couple of questions here, and I think that's all we have time for.
As you bring them up, I wish everybody could see the children in Dharamsala. Is that just like the faces that are so beautiful, so hopeful, so optimistic, even though some are separated from their families? Oh, that's Jim Sensenbrenner, Republican from Wisconsin, in that picture too. But the children, it's just such a remarkable thing about how wonderful they are, what they have within them, but also how they are treated with such respect. Thank you so much for that. It's a joy to the world.
I keep meeting people from all over, 35-year-old, 40-year-old Tibetans who remember me having gone to see them 30 years ago.
Yes.
And I'm moved. I start weeping at it that I can see them being so successful and happy and adjusted in the world, and also committed to the Tibetan cause and Tibetan culture.
Actually, we have many here.
Do we have them here? Do we have a lot of Tibetan students here? Please stand up. All of our Tibetan students, please stand up. Yes. Well done. Well done. That's great.
Beautiful.
All right, so this is about the Tibet Policy and Support Act. To Speaker Pelosi, do you anticipate much opposition, I think the word is, opposition to the Tibet Policy and Support Act of 2019 in Congress?
Okay. So this legislation has at the heart of it the idea of as you said, codifying earlier our position on the Dalai Lama and his successor and reincarnation and all of that, in addition to other provisions that we've had in there about appropriations and other policies that relate to that. But this one, the main focus is on hopefully no more, 20 years from now, whenever it may be, but that the succession, that the reincarnation, whatever.
Is not up to the Chinese.
It's not up to the
people.
Chinese. Imagine that, the hubris of it all. But anyway, to your question, we have bipartisan support in both houses. So far, we haven't seen any, the Chinese government rear its head in Washington, D.C. on this subject. They'll weigh in, but so far, so good. And I want to thank the International Committee for Tibet. I want to thank you. I want to thank Richard. I want to thank everybody and His Holiness and you as well, and all of you, because that is why we are having the success. We can maneuver all we want, emotionally, passionately, dispassionately, however, but the outside weighing in, especially in some of the places that might not be likely supporters, makes all the difference. So far, so good. I'll let you know if I see any wavering of that.
Yeah, the center, just to be clear, the center is about succession. It's about what is going to happen specifically to His Holiness and whether or not he can be co-opted by the Communist Party. And from ICT's point of view, this is central to what we will be doing this year and next year and years to come. This is central to it. If you give us support, this is where it's going to go. And this is not just in the US, but it's international. All of our offices around the world are working on this subject, and this is #1 priority for us. His Holiness has said he will not be reborn in a Chinese-controlled area. That's clear. There's some other language that has come out, and it hasn't been unpacked yet about what His Holiness is going to do by his own choice of where he's going to reincarnate. But he's made it very, very clear, and he's been steadfast. He will not be reborn in a Chinese-controlled area. So that's it. Final. Now, Jetsun Pamela, if I can read this. Do you anticipate much? No, I did that. What would you say to someone with limited means but a heart to serve the cause to save Tibet? What can they do to obtain to have a useful impact? Thank you.
Oh, for me. Well, I think at the moment, Tibet needs, as much support as possible, and we can do that. Like ICT is giving a lot of, information about Tibet. First of all, to give information about Tibet, and then secondly, also now what Speaker Pelosi is trying to do in the Congress, in the Senate, and I think those are important. But to do that also, America being a democratic country, I think we have to have the support of the people in every state. So we have Tibetans who are, in all these states, and I think they have to work on their representatives in the Senate, because most of the Tibetans who are now in America, they are American citizens. So as an American citizen, you have the right to request your senators and your congressmen to speak on behalf of the Tibetan people. And I think that's something which people can do. And then also, the Tibetan cause, it's a cause not just for the survival of a people, but it's also a cause where Tibetans have something to contribute. Because when Tibetans were first taken into America as a refugee group, the people who were responsible for this, they told His Holiness, we are helping the Tibetans not because you're refugees and that you need a home in the States, but we are helping the Tibetans because there's some things that we can learn from the Tibetans, the Tibetan way of life, the Tibetan attitude to life, and the way His Holiness and the Tibetan people has faced the tragedy of losing our country, and how we have taken this up, not with with hatred in our minds, but with a compassionate heart, and also, always having a good kind of a positive attitude, and all that kind of, sort of what the Tibetans cherish, being friendly, being honest, being helpful, being compassionate. These are qualities, I think, which everybody needs. And then also His Holiness's contribution in the world to spread peace and compassion. I think these are things which are appreciated all over the world, And I think helping the Tibetans is also saving the world to bring about more peace and compassion in the world. And this is something which I think, everybody can do. Yes, because it's helping the Tibetans as well as helping each individual who thinks that way. Is that okay?
If I may? That is so beautiful, and a proof of it, one manifestation of it is the person that I had the privilege of appointing to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Dr. Tenzin Dorji, who is with us. Dr. Dorji is still here? Is he with us? Thank you. And he is, we haven't had a Tibetan faith person on that commission, and he became the chairman of the commission. And so what's important about that is, as you were saying so beautifully and so inspiring about the contribution, but it's also about religious freedom writ large that is challenged throughout the world. But this issue, on the issue of Tibet, because you have a plan, we are able to be unified, Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate. This bill you asked about, Jim McGovern, the chairman of the Rules Committee, the Democratic chairman of the Rules Committee in the House, Marco Rubio in the Senate. So it's this important value of faith is only one part of the Tibetan contribution, but one that has captured the Congress of the United States in a bipartisan, bicameral way. Thank you, Doctor, for your leadership there. But we're all blessed and enhanced by the goodness of it all, the love that His Holiness tells us to have in our hearts, the negative attitudes He encouraged us to rid ourselves of, even against the Chinese who are torturing people in prison. But that's okay, I got it. I won't be holier than His Holiness in that regard. But aren't they wonderful to be here? What a beautiful sight you are. And you made Mateo, our dream, come true, because I wish you could see the children. And many of them are here today. That's what it's about, the future, about the children.
Well, I think that about does it. Look, I want to thank everyone for coming here, but of course I want to thank our two extraordinary women here, leaders, who we could do this for hours and hours and hours. There's so much that they could tell us. But Jetsun Pema Tujiche, thank you very much. Speaker Pelosi, Tujiche, thank you very much.
And let's hear it for Richard Gere. Isn't he wonderful to be a leader?
So thank you all for coming. We really thank you all very much for being here today for this very special event. So I hope we will be back soon in San Francisco, and thank you very much, Speaker, for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you,
thank you.
Mateo.
All right. Okay.